Hello everyone, and welcome back to If This Is True. And today, as I move through this series on net zero, I'm continually struck by the arrogance and dismissal of those we elect for those who elected them. We mostly see the end of what they've done and not the beginning. So they make changes that deeply affect us, and we're often left out of the process because it's left out of the media. So you don't know it's happened before it actually happens. Well, not this time. Not this time. Not if I can help it. Because the most important bill in a decade is being utterly ignored by your media in the hope that you won't notice. Well, I have. And now so have you. From my point of view, we should stop this bill, just like we stopped the pandemic treaty, because the climate and nature bill is potentially even worse. I know that's hard to believe, but it is. And freedom is hard won and very easily lost. As Thomas Jefferson said, the natural progression of things is for them to yield and government to gain ground. And they are. Because this bill, now heading for its second reading, with the support of 182 MPs, claims to save the planet. But it doesn't. What it does is it destroys your freedom. It's a vague, unnecessary law that opens the door to massive government overreach. The bill aligns closely with other international initiatives like the EU's Nature Restoration Law and the UN's Agenda 30, which both push for centralised environmental governance. Now, this bill's sponsor, it's a private member's bill, is Labour MP Alex Sobel, and he has a strong ideological commitment to environmental issues. He has all his life. Good for him. I have no problem with that. But the problem with Alex is that he has no business or economic experience in the private sector. Sobel's vision is a political ideology with no practicality at all. In fact, it's a socialist dream of control and conquer, a conquering of citizens' right to choose, and for a global ideology based on total control of everything really. We don't even need this bill. The UK already has the most robust, some would say the most overreaching climate laws. The Climate Change Act of 2008 legally binds us to the ridiculousness of net zero by 2050, which is already going to bankrupt us, by the way. And the Environmental Act of 2021, the Environment Act, sets ambitious, some would say, again, ridiculous biodiversity targets. And we know that these are already crippling some farmers. But, I am a big fan of the environment. I live on a farm. I spend my life protecting it. So shouldn't I be a fan of this bill? Well, no. And what I'm going to tell you here, I hope, means you're not a fan of this bill either. Here's the problem. To start with, there's no clarity or detail. There are no dates, no economic balance, no economic analysis for the impact of it. Instead, it just creates a vague, overarching framework. It can easily be misused, and it's broad enough to be interpreted in countless ways. But once it's passed, there's nothing we can do about it. The ways in which it's interpreted may not have been what was intended. And I'm not saying that Alex Sobel's vision didn't come from a good place. The problem is, it is totally open-ended, enough to let governments do just about anything they want and justify it in the name of saving the planet. Let's talk about what's in the bill and what it could actually mean in practice. And the key clauses that worry me, I think, should worry you. In clause 2, Point D, it says banning fossil fuels. What it says is the end of fossil fuel exploration, extraction, export, and import as rapidly as possible. Well, what could that mean? Well, it means bans or heavy taxes on petrol, diesel, heating fuel, making them even more unaffordable for millions. You will be forced into heat pumps because you won't be able to get the fuel for your boiler. And it will create wider and wider gaps between those who have and those who just haven't. And you may not want to give up your petrol or diesel car. I myself have said, well, I can keep my diesel car running for 20 years, but I can't if there's no fuel. And this part of the bill says that they will ban the imports. So those of you that swore you would never have an EV car, you'll have to. And rural communities, what happens to them? Well, transport is already sparse in our areas. This bill could leave people even more isolated, and in urban areas where you face overcrowding because we're all moving to town because it's the only place you can get transport. And then we move on to, again, clause 2, points A to C. Reducing emissions. What it says reduce emissions from UK activities and imports to meet the 1.5 global warming target. Now remember, no one asked you to vote on this target. It was just part of the Paris Agreement that became law through royal assent, not through parliamentary vote. And what it could mean is the things that I and others have already talked about. Think tanks and authoritarians love them. They're called personal carbon allowances. And we know that these are heavily recommended internationally through academic papers and NGOs. And you will, of course, be tracked through those digital IDs that they are absolutely convinced we all want, and your smart meter. So your travel, your energy use, and even your food choices could be monitored, and you could be penalised if you exceed your quota or your household quota. It's all very, what's the word? China. And meanwhile, the wealthy, many of them in the public sector funded by you and the elites, will continue to fly their private jets, and they will live their lives without these restrictions because they can afford not to. Points F through G talk about restoring ecosystems, but what it says is restore ecosystems and prioritize conservation. What could that mean? Well, it means farmers could face even more compulsory land purchasing, this time for rewilding projects. That's on top of those compulsory purchases for solar farms, access to solar farms, battery facilities, access to the battery facilities, and data centres, all eating away at agricultural land, which makes us ever more food insecure, not secure. It'll mean farmers and many of those living in rural areas losing their homes and their livelihoods. Rural areas might become more emptied under the guise of sustainability, forcing families into those already overcrowded urban centres. And now this is really interesting because it falls well into the vision, the international vision of C40 cities, whose chairman is Sadiq Khan, and who we know is a massive fan of this 15-minute plan where everything is within 15 minutes of where you live. You can't have that in a rural area. You could only possibly have it in an urban, overcrowded area. It also ties in well with Agenda 30 vision of those rural areas not being populated by humans at all. Now, I wouldn't call any of this a soft touch approach. I would call this a complete control of your choice of where you live. Let's move on to point H, called offsetting impacts. And what this says is that the UK will offset the adverse impacts of UK production and consumption. Offset our production and consumption. What could that mean? Well, it means that the wealthy buy their way out of restrictions through carbon offsets. So while the rest of us are rationing energy, we would perhaps sell our excess carbon quota to a richer person so that we could buy food and they could, of course, still go on holiday. It also means taxes on everyday consumer items like shoes, beds, small electrical appliances like kettles, almost every consumer product actually. And the gap between the wealthy and the ordinary will grow again, where only the rich will have the things that we've all become accustomed to. Freedom, travel, everyday items could become a luxury. Now, this is not a theoretical situation. This is something that actually is happening in practice. And some of these duties and taxes will become law in 2026. The EU already have them in place now. Now, moving on to clause 3. This says that the government will establish an unelected assembly to advise on strategies to meet this bill's goals. What? We're going to put in place an unelected committee to make sure that the goals of this bill actually happen? Well, what does that mean? It means policies like those carbon quotas and travel bans could be pushed through without any public accountability. They will never need to vote on it again because this bill was already passed. And don't forget, our policies in the UK are already heavily influenced and determined by the Climate Change Committee. In fact, I'm going to do a talk on the Climate Change Committee because mostly they used to work in the renewable energy sector. But anyway, I've digressed. Moving on. It would mean even more technocrats and not the people, not us citizens, would shape our future. And they would justify their recommendations as expert advice. And we know from history, we know from COVID, that the experts can't be questioned. Of course not. So what's the real purpose of this bill then? Because on the surface, yes, it's presented as a moral obligation to tackle climate and biodiversity challenges. But if you scratch the surface, it really is just a framework for massive control. And once it becomes law, this government and future governments can use it to justify sweeping restrictions on all of your personal freedoms and your economic choices. And they'll say it was democratically approved because this time our MPs, without really thinking about it, because it makes them good people, have voted it through. The bill doesn't empower communities. It disempowers them. It's not about solutions. There's no solution to any of the challenges in this bill. It is only about how we can be controlled. And history shows us that power, once given to governments, is rarely given back. And from the perspectives of all of our communities, farming, ordinary working people, from our perspective, the Climate and Nature Bill isn't something to celebrate. It's something to be horrified about. The vague promises of ecosystem restoration, the cutting of emissions, mask the realities of what will happen, which will be displacement, surveillance, more restrictions than you could ever imagine. This is prioritizing ideology over all practicality, over all democracy. If passed, this bill could now or in the future strip away freedoms under the guise of saving the planet. Now, of course, there will be elections, both locally and of course a general election, probably before 2030, of course, which means As a democracy, and whilst we still are one, it is up to us to stay involved. It's up to us to keep a hold of our freedoms, the ones we've won, and not lose them because it is fragile. Do not be willing to trade it away so easily. The bill gets its second reading on the 24th of January, and I am begging you, contact your MP, ask them these questions. Ask them about the clauses that I've given to you. I've got them on my X feed, and I will keep repeating them and keep reposting them until the 24th. Come on, people. This is our land. Don't let unelected committees take it away from you. So that was it for today's shocker on If This Is True. Please like and subscribe and leave me a comment. What do you think? Is this gradual encroachment of your freedom something you're worried about, or don't you care? I want to know what you think. See you next time on If This Is True.